Welcome back, everyone. Today I want to deal with what I'm calling beyond mitigation. I've touched on this on some of the other podcasts, but I really wanted to delve a little deeper and spell things out a little more, because I actually think if there was one thing I want to get across from my podcast, it would be this concept. And because I think it's not just applicable to regenerative agriculture, but it's sort of a worldview, a way of approaching life in general. So I wanted to start with an anecdote that I had heard on a podcast. I think it was Primal Blueprint. I think Elle was interviewing a guy named Calvin Ballister. And I think if I remember the details right, he had been a construction worker and he had fallen from a significant height and he had fallen down onto concrete, had crazy injuries, including severe head trauma. And the doctors had given him like 10% chance to live. And if he did live, it was most likely he was going to be a vegetable. But he had recovered. He had, recovered from paralysis. He had eventually been able to talk and breathe on his own, and then he just kept improving. And much of his journey of improvement had to do with nutrition. So they had been talking a lot about all these physical things and how all these improvements, and it was all about good food, which included the saturated fats and the meat and all that. But what I wanted to get at was a little anecdote. Well, she moved on and she asked him about like emotional issues and how he had to deal with. Obviously, he had dealt with some despair, and so I loved his answer. His answer was that he saw the brain much like a garden, and how there's thousands upon thousands of neurons, and they're all making these connections and synapses, and there's going to be so many different kinds of plants, and some of them are going to be good, juicy, garden plants, and others are going to be weeds. And he's really, his view was that you just couldn't spend your time just trying to go around weeding out ripping up all the weeds out. And so, for him, it was an issue of you really got to cultivate the good thoughts. You got to cultivate the good patterns, and then if they can just become healthy enough, they just there's not as much room for the weeds to be there, and they get sort of outgrown by all the other, all the good things. And in fact, to focus on the weeds somewhat is oftentimes you give them more attention than they warrant, and they often, under that sort of tension, they kind of grow in their own way and become the focus. Whereas he thought really the focus needed to be the positive. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. And I do think that how this is applicable very much is, when we're dealing with kids, and we may start out in life where we're like, hey, no, don't go down the stairs head first. That cause severe damage. Don't cross the street without holding hands. If we have a lot of do's and don'ts, and at the very beginning of life, they have to sort of learn how to navigate, and mostly so that they can remain safe, mostly so that they aren't a danger to themselves and others. And that's appropriate at the very beginning level. But it would be extremely sad if that was really the ultimate goal of anyone's relationship with their child. You want to move on to one of much more rich and about positive things. And this can also be very much, I would draw parallels to spirituality, where when you have in the Old Testament with your do's and your don'ts, and thou shalt not, and don't steal, and don't lie, and don't covet, and don't don't do all these things that when came down to it, Jesus summed them up as love your neighbor as yourself. And in that positive thing, obviously, it's so much more rich. And those other things are just kind of a given. You don't, if you love someone, you don't steal from them. You don't cheat on them. You don't lie to them. So, with that in mind, I think that we could stand to really bear that sort of approach when we think of issues like environmental issues or agricultural issues. And because the predominant approach of how we try to solve the problems of today is about mitigation. And in many cases, this is appropriate. This is like the little kid, right? So if we have, if we want to limit damage, like for instance, like in milk, right? We have a history in this country where there was a point where they were bringing milk to the cities and it was not staying fresh long enough, so it got bad and people were getting sick. So, then we started heating it up and pasteurizing and homogenizing it. And we built a whole system on that as if that was the real end goal, instead of that being sort of a stopgap measure of a situation where you weren't getting the real thing. And so here we have, at this point, definitely, it's an issue of safety. You don't want to drink the regular conventional milk because there's a significant percentage of that that's, it's got pus in it. It's from the mastitis and the sick animals, and it just simply wouldn't be safe to drink. And we have this approach as well, for climate change or whatnot. We have this idea that, we'll offset things, like if we can plant trees to offset damage. I remember listening to a musician at one point, and his wife was into sustainable issues, and they asked him why he was driving around, I can't remember, it was a Jaguar or if it was an SUV or whatever, some sort of question, and he was like, well, I'm fine. I don't mind if I'm using up some, not being energy efficient here because I've paid so much money here to have 1,000 trees planted over here. And so it becomes this sort of equation, the same sort of equation it would be going to like carbon tax, right? So where you quantify things and you can trade, and then, if you're going to pollute over here, that means that you have to buy up someone's carbon, some sort of number of carbon so that someone else is not polluting as much, which may all be important steps of us being able to, get control once again over the industry and its levels of damage. That's one way to get control of damage, but it's really not a true answer. And when it comes to food and it comes to agriculture, this is the category that I automatically put organic in. I think it's the very rare case that organic actually goes beyond mitigation. And so pretty much, and this can really be, gives you a clue in that much of the organic food is done and produced by the exact same producers who are producing the conventional food. I believe this happens with vegetables, and I know it happens with animals, so that you may have, several buildings of 100,000 chickens or whatever, laying eggs, and they're fed conventional feed and whatnot. And then you may set aside another building just alongside your others, but a little bit separate, and you're giving them a little bit different inputs. So you're giving them less malignant inputs. So you're mitigating the bad stuff that you're giving them, but it's still all under the same paradigm. Right? Or vegetables, I imagine, would be the same thing, where you have these, very vast, monocrop or acreage where most of it is done by heavy technological dependency. And you just, instead of putting, maybe synthetic fertilizers, you're trying to get, more organic fertilizers and pesticides. You're getting it from plant chemicals rather than something that was made in the factory, but you haven't really changed your paradigm. And this is very important in the sense that we never change our focus. We never get beyond this relationship with our child of, don't go out in the street, without holding an adult's hand, or, we're stuck in this very simplistic, and it just doesn't get us very far. And I think of a store near us here. It's a natural food store, and they're trying to do what they can. So they want to get, organic if they can, or more natural, and they want to get local. And, you would think that all these things, would end up as a very positive thing. But I remember being very disappointed. I went to go check it out, and I was not impressed with what was inside. But what even impressed me even less was there was this sign, and it was out in the parking lot. And I kind of don't want to pick on these guys, but because they're trying to mitigate some damage. But I just feel that we missed the boat. So here's their philosophy. Their philosophy is like, and it said, our philosophy is, and then it had these like bullet points, and it was like, all our food will be free from. So it'll be free from maybe antibiotics or, trans fats or high fructose or synthetic, pesticides or, all these different things. And the entire thing is nothing on the positive, it's like we will just be mitigating some of these bad things that are in your food. And we miss the boat. We miss what's actually going on, what actually we're missing out, and we're actually not providing any answers. We're just trying to not do as much damage. And I don't think we're actually going to provide any solutions that way. So I wanted to give an example of this that'll bring out what exactly I mean here. And it's just sort of a pet peeve of mine. And, let me give a little anecdote because this just happened not too long ago. I was at the farmer's market, and it was on a Wednesday, so it wasn't quite as busy. And it was also at the start of the season, so there weren't as many vendors, so there were some extra spots underneath the structure. And at those times, you can be a group of something, and you can just pay a small fee, and then you set up a booth, and you can in this case, it was an environmental group, and they were all about sustainability. And it was a student group from the college at Virginia Tech, and very well-meaning, intentional, well-intentioned kids. And they had all these signs out, and of course they're right next to me. And they bring out that sign that always comes out at these sustainable things, and it's this water chart. And they have this little chart, and it says, it takes 1,500 or to 2,000 gallons of water to make 1 pound of beef. And then it says, and beans are another great source of protein, and it takes 50 gallons of water to make 1 pound of bean protein. And so I had a little time because it wasn't a very busy day, and I meandered over there, and as you realize you're right next to a meat vendor here, and like, oh yeah, well we know you're probably doing a pretty good job, and they're very nice, and I think probably most of them were vegetarian, so but they're doing it for very well-intentioned reasons. So I said, well, let's get talking about this, because I say, obviously this is a good statement if you're talking about, animals that are raised in feedlots, and if we're talking about an extraction model, and we're talking about just seeing food as a resource and mining it from the ground. And, in a sense, if we look at water as being pretty much in an extraction model, water is pretty like equivalent to something like gas or something, right? So you have gas and you're burning it up in your car. Well, here we go. We've got one car that's like, the big Hummer of all Hummers, and it's, guzzling up 1,500 gallons of water or gas to get you 1 mile. And the beans can do it for 50, and so within that model that, it makes a lot of sense. And I said, yeah, well, what about, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we got talking about, sustainable, and they're like, well, we're sure, you're probably doing a pretty good job. And in a sense, I was mitigating a lot of the damage and whatnot. And I said, well, I'm going to push a little farther. I said, any of you guys been on a farm? And there was this one girl who had been, and she had grown up on a farm, or at least had cows and stuff that had been in the, may have been her grandparents' farm. I don't remember the details, but she's sort of the one that engaged with me. And I said, well, let's talk about what's going on with the water, right? Because if we're talking about sustainability, we're worried about climate change, and that's all about, water cycles and what's going on. So I said, okay, so here we have a farm, and let's say we're no longer talking about a feedlot, but now we're talking about rotational grazing, because that's what I do. And, most farms like that, they're getting their water either from a stream, a spring, or or from a well, right? So in our case, we have a spring, and it's one of the first springs that starts and it flows into, eventually becomes a river, and it joins some other waters on the way, but we're up high in the mountains, so this is where the water starts. And this is fresh water, right? And this is fresh water that, sure, it'll go down into the streams, and it'll provide some water for plants along the streams, and it may provide some home for fish and aquatic animals and whatnot. But the vast majority of that water is going to end up in the ocean, in the salt water, right? And so here we are, and we're worried about water, and we're worried about fresh water. So we take that fresh water, and I kind of did this where I sort of walked her through, and I said, well, what happens to that water? And I'm going to put it somewhere, and I'm going to divert it from the stream, whether it's just gravity fed or if I'm pumping it. So I pump it into, some big container so that they can drink, I said, and so the cow drinks, right? So now suddenly we've changed a lot of the equation. So, and this, you don't want to throw too much out there, but the math becomes suddenly very, very different, right? If that 1,500 gallons of water is including what it took to raise the corn, to feed this cow, what it took to transport all that stuff to get it to them and whatnot. So now suddenly we're dealing with a cow that's on the pasture, and the water's getting diverted directly to them. And they're not eating any grain. And in my case, it's mostly sheep. I have very few cows, but it's mostly sheep. But everything that I talk about cows relates to sheep as well, because they're 100% grass-fed ruminants. But I do have a milk cow, so so we talked a little bit about the math there, where, so a milk cow is, she may drink a lot of gallons. Maybe she drinks 20 gallons that day, and then we have a Jersey, so she may give us, only 3 gallons back from that 20 gallons that she drank, but it's going to be extremely high in fat, extremely high in nutrition and whatnot. So here we have very different equation for milk cows. They give you back an unbelievable amount for what they're drinking. But we could talk about beef too. So if you got some beeves or some steers or whatnot, and they're maybe gaining at, 1.5 pounds a day or something, and they're not going to drink as much as a milk cow, so we're talking more like, maybe 10 gallons to produce one, just for a very rough estimate, 10 gallons here, and you're getting 1 pound of meat out of it of gain on the animal. So that's a very different equation. However, I said, but I'm willing to take your math, right? Let's say we even took your math and we took it at 1,500 versus the 50. I said, well, let's say we're taking this cow and we take that water, we take that fresh water, and now we put it through the system of the cow. So we're taking it out of this water, that vast majority of it is going to end up in the saltwater ocean, and we give it to this cow. And then what happens to it? And then this girl was plenty informed, and she knew that, okay, well, most of it, some of it goes to growing the animal, but a lot of it goes into the urine, and the urine is full of all sorts of nutrients. And the urine is full of very heavy nitrogen, and salt and all this stuff. And so that gets peed out, and it goes to the pasture. And so there we go, and we got the grass and the pasture, and then suddenly they're getting a nice flush of nitrogen, and they're getting water. And that organic material that's in the soil is able to retain that water. And so we've now we've now taken that water and we've put it through the system and we've ameliorated that water. And then as it comes out of that system, because this is what those ecological cycles do, the output from one system is not waste, but actually it has, increased in benefit, and it's the input to the next one. And so it's all about growing soil. It's all about retaining organic material. It's all about retaining fresh water on the land. It's all about, sequestering more carbon. And so here we have a system, and I said, well, let's talk about the beans a little bit, right? So here we have beans, and it's probably been plowed, so you've disturbed, you've taken your vegetables and you've plowed the land very, very probably with a technology, probably with a tractor and everything. So you've used gas for that, and you've plowed it and you planted it, and maybe you fertilized it and you did all this thing. And I got a little bit into the darker side of growing vegetables, where you're disturbing the soil and you're breaking the structure, and then who knows what you've put, what sort of inputs have you given for this bean to grow, and are they chemical based, and have they killed, plant life as well as, animal life or bacterial life within the soil, and all, however, you've only used 50 gallons of water to grow that pound of beans. But what has the beans actually returned to the soil? Very little, if next to nothing, especially compared to what a cow has done when they've taken that water. And so, and this girl that I was talking to, mainly this one girl, the others were just kind of on the side listening, sort of vaguely, not sure what they thought about this crazy man. But, she's like, oh, you're right. It's really not, as you're not really doing as much damage as I thought. And I said, well, let me push it just a little further. And I said, well, if you had the choice, even if I take your math, which is ridiculous, it's math based on an entirely different system. But even if you took your math and you said, I want to take 50 gallons of water and put it to this bean, and I'm going to use it up like gas because that's an extraction system, or I want to take 1,500 gallons to make 1 pound of meat, which is bad math anyways, but even if it was good math, but if I was taking that 1,500 gallons of water and I was putting it through a system that actually was making that water better, and then I was giving nitrogen in return to the plants and helping the plants grow and helping the soil grow, I said, which system do you want to put your water in? And, I'm not sure if if she really got it, but I was just trying to change the sense of, right, one sort of paradigm when we're stuck in this extraction model, and we always see water and we see soil and we see everything as a resource to mine. It will always be about mitigation, always be trying to, let's not waste too much, or can we recycle this or whatnot. But nature is extravagant in its quote unquote waste, because the waste from an animal is always a very a big input for the next system that's going to receive that quote unquote waste, right? So people can talk about conversion rates. So like you have, an animal eats this much and they gain that much, they might eat 3 pounds of grain and they get 1 pound of weight from it. This is great. But, and they say, chicken is notorious for not using the nutrition within what it eats, so it's like, I don't know what the statistic is exactly, but maybe, it utilizes less than 50% of it, and it comes out really hot, right? So they call it hot manure. And if it's, if you get too high of a concentration, it can actually burn the plant. So versus rabbits who they actually digest, they digest their food twice, and so their manure comes out as a colder manure, and it's, they've used more nutrients, and then it's like, but not, you can put it directly on your garden stuff, right? But all those nutrients that the chicken wasted and didn't convert is now in a manure in a high bacterial form that actually provides an incredible amount of nitrogen for the plants and stuff. So this whole idea of systems that feed into other systems is an entirely different approach than mitigation, right? So, I mean, when you talk about the technological and how we're gonna feed the world. You know, the big solutions for a long time now. We're gonna have vertical agriculture where we're gonna have these big buildings and everything's gonna be recycled, and we're gonna use 50% less water, and we're gonna mitigate all this waste, and it's gonna be very minimal waste. But they've unplugged themselves from nature, and they've unplugged themselves from all these cycles that are not about trying to get as close to zero damage as we can, but they're actually about growing fertility, actually about increasing fertility, and actually about growing in complexity and systems that, the more complex and more diverse your systems are, the healthier you are. So they're growing in health. Same sort of thing. I've been in some discussions with very, very smart and intelligent people that are talking about the third industrial revolution, right? And this is about how the internet and the transportation and everything's becoming much more efficient. And in that concept is the aggregate efficiency, the waste that happens as, things are transported, or they move from one place to another, or if we, from one hand to another. And the entire focus on that is that we're, in a sense, it's that Newtonian, we're losing heat every time there's friction. And, and here we have this aggregate efficiency that we're losing every time we have an interaction. And so this whole paradigm is about, let's bring that down to zero, right? Whereas nature and ecology is all about the opposite. No, let's have a little friction. Every time these systems are interacting, let's have a little friction, because within that friction, there's a whole explosion of life that happens within that, right? So if you have, anytime you have in the soil, you have a worm or a nematode or, and it's eating all the stuff every time, like say it dies or something, right? So, suddenly it's just a burst of all these nutrients that are available for everything that's around it, so every time there's friction or what we would think maybe in a lot of cases as negative things or waste, this is actually nature's way of just, it's part of the currency of nature where, the output from one system is the input to another. And so if we start trying to take that away and make things as mechanical as we can, and we have this idea of efficiency that is where everything is separate from each other. If you're an isolated system without interaction with any other system, then it makes sense that you want to bring everything down to zero waste, and you want to have, you want to mitigate any sort of loss of anything. But when you're in community with systems all over the place, that doesn't make any sense. I want to be clear. I'm not against mitigation. I mean, the reality of the world is that it's full of systems of extraction. It's full of very damaging industrial systems. And yes, we're going to have regulations. We're going to have, emissions caps. We're going to have to get control of the carbon. We're going to have to, have rules about, how much poison can be in your food. We got to continue finding that threshold of, the maximum amount of poison that can be in your food where you can still be okay to eat. That's all about safety. And that's just kind of something we're going to have because we're living in a world full of these systems that are very detrimental and very damaging. But what I want to do is remind people that that's the stage of the toddler, right? That's the stage of just trying to keep safe by living in a world of do's and don'ts. And I want to, if I could refer back to the anecdote from Calvin and the brain and the weeds and the garden, that the danger is that we just get focused on the weeds and we get focused on eradicating weeds. And that's not really the point of the garden. The point of the garden is to grow these wonderful fruitful plants. And so if we can remember that, and this is the whole idea of immersion. This is the whole idea of Gestalt, of the Kierkegaardian leap. Things emerge. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this happens with interconnections. So we've got to get ourselves plugged into and interconnected with systems that are healthy, systems that, are connected to the soil, systems that are regenerative. And in doing so, if we can, cultivate these, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about social, whether we're talking about political, economic, all these systems are going to intertwine as long as they're creative and regenerative. Good things are going to come, and we can't even predict what they're going to be. And that's the beauty of the Gestalt and everything. So, if we can just remember that mitigation is kind of a necessarily sort of discipline that we got to do. But really any solution, any sort of real life of rich life is going to have to go beyond mitigation, and we're going to have to interconnect with systems that are regenerative and systems that are healthy. All right, thanks for listening.